Oh, hi. So today we are going to discuss IGCSE Business Studies. The topic that we are going to focus is finance. Let's have a look. So here we have an activity where we have to discuss short-term finance and long-term finance, different sources which are possible. And then we will do this exercise, see if we understand which source of finance could be termed as short-term, which source of finance could be termed as long-term. So what do we have? In the first, you can see here, you have the sources of finance. And these are the different sources that are given. Then we need to understand and write here whether we think it's a short-term source of finance or what do we think is a long-term source of finance. So the first one is an overdraft. So what is an overdraft? Do you recall from your IGCSE notes and textbook, right? Well, a bit of a hint in undertaking this activity. First thing you need to understand, what do you mean by the term when you say short-term source of finance and a long-term source of finance? So a short-term source of finance is a source of finance which is normally regarded for a period less than a year. So a short-term source of finance would be any source of finance which is less than a year. That is the difference between, and of course, alternatively, the long-term source of finance would be source of finance is more than 1 year, right? Which you need for more than a period of 1 year, which you utilize for more than a period of 1 year. 1 year, and I'm just writing at the very top, is the key thing to remember while undertaking this question, that short term versus long term, the period that determines 1 year. All right, let's go back here now. Overdraft. So what do you think? Is it short term or long term source of finance? I've already given a hint, and yes, you're right. It is a short term source of finance, and in fact, if you remember the definition, banks normally allow companies, businesses to take more cash than they have in the account. And of course, interest is charged, but normally this is utilized for short term. Debentures, right? Well, it is a long term source of finance. You issue debentures for which you pay interest later on, and that could go for years and years, 10 years or 5 years, depending upon terms, and it is an example of long-term source of finance. What about issue of shares? Now, as you have realized, this source of finance is different from the above two. Why is it so? Right, well done. It is unlike the first two. This is a equity source of finance. This is not a loan. So in this case, you are raising finance by giving share of your company or business part ownership. And as you can understand, once you give someone part ownership, of course, against funds, capital, or money, it's going to be long term. It is forever actually. You've given it. So this is also example of a long-term source of finance. 4-year bank loan. I think it's a bit of self-explanatory, and the key words to pick up here are the first two, which is 4-year. And we already determined the difference between short-term and long-term source of finance is a period of 1 year. So it's quite clear because we've already mentioned here 4-year. So this is also going to be example of long-term source of finance. Trade credit. Thoughts? Do remember trade credit is when you pay supplier a bit late or supplier provides more time for the payment, and that helps a business in cash flow. But as you can understand, a supplier is not going to wait forever or for many years. It's mostly for inventories and supplies. So this form of finance is also for short term. Hire purchase. If you remember what is hire purchase, the asset you take and then the payments you make. Remember from your textbook notes, you'll realize that it happens for a period which is, yes, right, which is more than 1 year. Hence, this is also example of a long-term source of finance. So if you see the different sources of finance that we have discussed, especially from the exam point of view, key thing is to remember whichever you see and pick up the time period for which it will be required. For example, the first 4-year bank loan was quite clear it's going to be more than 1 year, and hence a very clear example of long-term source of finance. Same could be said about issue of shares, which is giving your own part ownership against capital and money, and that's very long term. So remember, in undertaking such questions, first identify and remember from your coursebook and syllabus whether this source of finance is for a period less than 1 year or more than 1 year. And that will help you to undertake such activities correctly and successfully. Thank you very much.